Well, and welcome to this exciting video lecture. And in fact, this is my second attempt to record this. I spent 44 minutes yesterday recording this and nothing. Something happened. I don't know what. Can you hear the remnants of the simmering rage in my voice? Yes, but it's not your fault. It's the gods of PowerPoint. Who knows what happened? Anyway. Maybe I'll be a little more efficient this time, a little bit more focused, so it might work to your advantage. So we're going to talk about post-World War II, the subcontinent. Now, normally that refers to the big word India, but you'll notice on the map here too, and it's called a subcontinent because it is a part of Asia, but it's the underneath big chunk of it, and we can talk some geography stuff that I won't bother with, but the subcontinent. But you will notice that what you see over on the left, and this is under the British, you had all of India going up to Afghanistan, which sometimes has been a part of India, to, in fact, Burma, known today more often as Myanmar, but known as both, which was actually incorporated into the British Empire as a part of India, which really irritated the Burmese because they are culturally, linguistically, historically, you name it, utterly different from India. Well, look at what we have since. We not only have a smaller India, but we've got that little teardrop at the bottom, the Buddhist country of Sri Lanka. We've got Bhutan, which is a Buddhist kingdom that is teeny tiny, and you've probably never heard of it, and you may never meet anyone who's been there. I've met one person in my life because it's very hard to get in. You've got, of course, Burma, Myanmar, as a separate independent country, which probably should have stayed in the first place. And then you've also got Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are Muslim-majority countries that actually, as you'll see, were linked as one after World War II, and then separated in 1971. Quick look at the timeline. I mean, we recall that the British East India Company, this is obviously beforehand, started showing up in 1600 or so, something like this. Remember that the BEIC was it was a private company, shareholders, stockholders, etc. However, remember that the British system of mercantilism, where we need to bring as much wealth as possible back into the home country. Well, the British East India Company did that and did that well. So the BEIC, although it was not a British government entity, was, very much supported by the British government with pretty much anything they could, from weapons to political support to financial support. As things begin to change, remember in 1857, you have that massive rebellion or war for independence or revolt, call it what you want to, but this is where both Hindu and Muslim soldiers began to rebel against the British. Ostensibly, it was about, there's pig fat or cow fat. It had to do a lot more with dissatisfaction. British control by the 1750s, the British East India Company really was the ruler of India. And the fact that the British are becoming more and more dominant. Look, India is a culture that goes back as independent kingdoms over 2,000 years old. It didn't sit well with most Indians. And so there's a lot of dissatisfaction with this. Because of that revolt, the British government decides, India is just too important to us. We need to get rid of the British East India Company. That's an old-fashioned thing. We will assume direct control of India. India is now a part of England. 30 years later, the Indian National Congress is formed. Remember, this is not initially an independence organization. The first couple of presidents are actually British people living in India, but the idea is more autonomy, more representation for Indian people as part of the big empire. In 1905, we won't go into the details here, but the British actually divide off Bengal, which is the eastern part of the empire, Bangladesh, Bengal. Yep, that's where it came from, partly because it had a Muslim majority. It was annulled. That was changed. There was a lot of protest about it, but notice we are seeing a hint of, Muslim India somehow separate from the Hindu majority. And in fact, the next year, the All India Muslim League, or the Muslim League it is called, is formed. Keep in mind, this is not a Muslim separatist organization. most of the people that were part of the Muslim League were also members of the Indian National Congress, but they did recognize that as a 20-25% minority population with India, Muslims might have, well, watch out for themselves a little bit. Now, remember when World War I breaks out in 1914, one of the great fears of the British was that India, the empire, would not remain loyal. And in fact, most Indians really do remain loyal to the British Empire. However, they use this. Remember that there was a meeting in a town called Lucknow in India with both the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress, and they start making some demands, not for independence in 1916, but for more representation, more rights, more respect, etc. And because the British cannot afford to anger the Indians, they kind of have to let that statement go. Now, in 1919, the war is over. During the war, there were some restrictions on freedom of speech, on freedom of assembly. You couldn't criticize the British government. And it's not that all Indians were happy with this. A lot were not. And I'm not even saying it was right. But there was at least a sense of, well, Britain is in a war, perhaps for its survival, if we want to be dramatic. It's kind of understandable, or at least worth understanding why there are some restrictions on freedom of speech. But in 1919, the war is over, and the Rowlatt Acts of 1919 extend the censorship, the limits of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. And it's quite clear this has nothing to do with unifying during a war. It's to get the Indians to shut up and stop advocating for more rights. This leads to nonviolent protests across India, and of course in Amritsar, in western India, there was what they call the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, where British tanks and machine guns come in and kill, it's 400, 500, 600 people that are peacefully protesting against the Rowlatt Acts. And many, many argue that, you know what, at this point, England had surrendered any ability to continue ruling over India. It was a matter of time. In fact, the next year, Mohandas Gandhi, who is emerging as the dominant force within the Indian independence movement, begins the Satyagraha movement. Satyagraha, again, meaning non-compliance. We're not going to follow your rules. We're not going to use violence, but we're not going to follow British rules. And it's worth mentioning, 10 years later, the first member of the Muslim League with some stature says, you know what, we need an independent Pakistan for the Muslim population. And that kind of steamrolls, as you'll see. There is the Government of India Act, where the British recognize they're starting to lose control over India, so they give the Indians more independence, more autonomy, more separation. But it's not enough, because Muhammad Ali Jinnah, notice in 1940, World War II has begun, England is being bombed. Not only is there more and more advocacy in India for an independent India, but Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the head of the Muslim League, he is the Gandhi of eventual Pakistan, calls for a separate Muslim kingdom. Interestingly, Jinnah himself is not a terribly religious guy. He ate pork, he drank whiskey, he had no problems with this. He himself wanted a Pakistan not for religious purposes. In fact, some of his early statements really quite inspiring. He says, look, we're going to set up a separate Islamic Muslim majority nation of Pakistan, but your own personal religious beliefs, the state has nothing to do with this. You can say and believe and do what you want to, but the reality is we are a minority of people in a huge country that's going to be called India. We will simply never have equal rights. We will simply never have the power that we need. Therefore, for political, for economic reasons, we need a separate Pakistan, not for religious reasons. Gandhi was very much opposed to this, and he said to Jinnah, Mr. Jinnah, I give you my word that when we remain one India, you Muslim people are going to be treated as equals. And Jinnah, who didn't even always like Gandhi that much, but did respect him, said, Mr. Gandhi, if all Hindus were you, I would accept that. But I'm talking reality here. we need our own land to benefit ourselves. The Muslim League passes a divide and quit resolution. Divide India into Muslim and Hindu majority and quit the British Empire. When World War II ends in 1945, you know what? The writing is on the cake. It's pretty clear that India is going to separate, and you start seeing horrible, bloody communal riots in Calcutta. Muslims versus Hindus, Hindus versus Muslims, people killed by the hundreds, by the thousands. One of the things that's so remarkable about this is that Mohandas Gandhi decides to go to Calcutta and stay in the Muslim sector. And his thinking is this: he can bring, he believes, peace between the peoples because the Muslims will not dare to allow him to be killed because there will be repercussions. The Hindus will have to hold off attacking because their leader Mohandas Gandhi is there. Gandhi's a tricky figure. There is a dark or questionable side to Gandhi because he was a human being, but the guy had a lot of courage. There's no question about that. Finally, in June of 1943, Lord Mountbatten, who was the last viceroy, the last governor, is the guy who he announced, the British government says, you know what, we give up. India's going to be independent. The initial plan is that it'll happen over the next year. But you know what? The Indian and Pakistani people don't trust this. And it makes sense. In some ways, it would have made a lot easier if India had gained its independence over a few years more gradually. But understandably, Indian people, Pakistani people didn't trust the British to really leave. So there was a push, and within a couple of months, independence was declared. Wait, is it August 14th or 15th? August 14th is Independence Day in India. And then at midnight on August 15th, it's Independence Day in Pakistan. I don't know if this is going to play right. Gosh, I don't know. I just skipped ahead on something, and I hope very much this is going to continue here because I'm very nervous that I just screwed up by accidentally moving ahead. I was saying that Nehru, what an incredibly handsome guy, and to the degree there is a belief in Pakistan that India got too much out of partition and Pakistan didn't get what it was supposed to get. And, to a degree, Nehru and Gandhi were very, very charming, charismatic people. Jinnah lesser so. He just didn't have that way with people. There is a wonderful story when Jinnah went to meet with Lord Mountbatten, who you see in the bottom left, the final governor of British India. And he knows he's going to pose for a photograph with Lord Mountbatten and his wife Edwina. And he assumed that the shorter woman would stand in the middle. And Jinnah decides, well, I'm going to say something really charming and witty to get over my reputation as being a little stiff. I'm going to say, a rose surrounded by two thorns, i.e. the lovely rose in the middle with Mountbatten and Jinnah, the thorns on the outside. For whatever reason, the photographer put Mr. Jinnah in the middle, surrounded by the Mountbattens. And Jinnah, not quite able to adjust, says, a rose surrounded by two thorns. And that's just not what he wanted to say in that circumstance. So, amusing story, but a little bit of an insight into Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So you'll see the partition of India in 1947. And if you look closely, well, not that closely, it's pretty obvious, you'll see West Pakistan and East Pakistan. This is one country with 1,000 miles of India in between, and you can already see some problems with this. If you look, and this time you do look a little more closely, there are all these arrows, and you're noticing blue arrow from India into West Pakistan, 5.9 million. Purple arrow from West Pakistan into India, 4 million. Well, this is the movement of populations. As it is announced, there is no law in either state that Hindus must go to India, Muslims must go to parts of Pakistan at all. But violence starts to break out, jealousy breaks out, and people begin a mad scramble to get to their religious homeland. It is thought that something like, I think 15 million people cross borders, leave their homes of sometimes years, decades, generations even, to get to that new state. And there's an awful lot of violence and chaos that comes with this. Jinnah and the Muslim minority, about 20-25% of the population, you know what? We need our own homeland. Pakistanis felt and feel to this day like they never got a fair shake in this, that the line was drawn by the British. It benefited India rather than Pakistan. And in fact, what you've got now is an East and West Pakistan, separated not only by 1,000 miles of India, but also language, culture. The Bengali region of India simply was different than the Western Indian population that became West Pakistan and eventually Pakistan. So it's definitely not a good start. And again, you see the numbers here and all the millions of people going from one side to the next. Kashmir is particularly, by the way, one of the most, I didn't quite get to Kashmir, but I came very close. Unbelievably gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. It is a Muslim majority area in the north, led by a Sikh of all people. Remember that religious minority that is, it's monotheistic like Islam, but has an awful lot of Hindu practices, etc. They wanted to remain independent. However, they ended up joining India. Pakistan tried to force him. Hari Singh, although Muslims, said, well, we're going to be a part of India. And this is a great problem over the years. There have been 4 Indo-Pakistani wars over time. In fact, there was, and you know what, if you watch the papers these next couple of years, you're going to see that there will be some little skirmish sometime leading to a few deaths in Kashmir, and it continues. There has recently been the very, very Hindu president, the Hindu nationalist president of India. His last name is Modi. I forget his first name. But Modi has put major restrictions upon the Muslim majority in Kashmir. A lot of controversy about that. Definitely, it's definitely ongoing, a potential flashpoint. In particular, in Kashmir, there was, I believe it is the highest altitude military battle in history. And it's something like 6,000 or 7,000 meters. There was an exchange in which a number of people were killed where Indian and Pakistani soldiers were fighting over a glacier. And I'm not making this up. You'll notice that there are 3 parts of Kashmir. There is the Karakoram Range you see in the green. That is Pakistan. The Jammu and Kashmir is Indian, and there is also a Chinese part of it, and that actually led to a war between India and India and China in 1962, which thankfully did not go nuclear. China, I believe, had nuclear weapons by then, but I'm not sure about that. Yeah, this is probably the largest short migration history. I mean, something, within a year or two, something like 15 million people gather up all their stuff and move. Most of them had no intentions of moving, the Hindus to India, the Muslims to Pakistan, or what became Bangladesh. They had to, because violence started breaking out. And it's a spiral of violence. There is anger over the division of property in one area, and Hindus kill Muslims, and Muslims retaliate, and words gets out that the Muslims are trying to kill all Hindus, and so the Hindus attack Muslims, and the word get out that Hindus are trying to kill all Muslims. There are just horrific stories about this. Train loads of desperate people leave one part of India, show up at the station in the other part of what is Pakistan, or in the other direction, India, and they open up the doors and everybody has been massacred. Nobody really knows how many people died, but it's certainly in the hundreds of thousands, and some say maybe as many as 1 million people were massacred. Hindu on Muslim, Muslim on Indian, on Hindus, etc. And even, you'll see in the bottom right, even those many who survive, well, what you're seeing is they don't have homes. They're living in refugee camps. And this is, of course, devastating for an already very impoverished part of the world. Here's a library being divided up. These books go to Pakistan. These go to India. There are ridiculous stories about tables being cut in half because nobody wanted the other side to get it. And you've got to assume if the Radcliffe line is just being drawn on a map, well, that's going to divide not only ethnic groups and cities, but sometimes families and sometimes homes were divided. Strictly speaking, you need to have a visa to go from your bedroom to the bathroom. I mean, this is literally how this was done. You probably won't read them. I had them up for my Pakistani students. You can tell the internet was crummy 10 years ago. Look at how pixelated this is. These were the images I found online. But Freedom at Midnight and The Proudest Day are two of the really great books about that, about the partition and everything that led up to it. Nehru, Jawaharlal, I can say that name, yes I can. Remember that Gandhi was more of a spiritual, he's a political man, no question, but he never held a place in government. Nehru was kind of his right-hand man, and for the first 17 years, he was the president of India until his death. An absolute secularist, I guess a Hindu by birth, but was very, very clear. And Gandhi stood behind this. Gandhi was a very religious man, but saw India as being a multi-religious, secular democracy where there was, no insistence upon being any religion or the other. India is proud of itself today, the world's largest democracy. If I were to ask you what is the official religion of India, you'd all say Hinduism, and you would all be wrong. There is no state religion in India, although there have been increasing and I think very frightening moves toward imposing Hinduism as the official faith in India. The Modi government of the last 10 years is pretty hardcore on Hindu nationalism, and I think the results are potentially going to be pretty awful. But under Nehru's government, laws abolishing any discrimination, the caste system is completely illegal in India. Of course, it's still practiced. 5-year plans. Who else had 5-year economic plans? The Soviet Union and China, Stalin and Mao. Nehru is no communist at all, but he's definitely on the socialist left and sees in a developing country the state playing a real role in creating economic growth and controlling the economy. And again, it makes sense. Both China and Russia were poor, largely agricultural countries, and they seem to have some development. So it would make sense that Nehru would kind of follow that path. He was a founder of the non-alignment movement. Remember that meeting at Bandung in 1955? We are not with the Soviet Union. We're not with the United States. We are with the other former colonial peoples of the world. As a general rule, Nehru and India were probably a little bit closer to the Soviet Union. Pakistan was a little bit closer to the United States, but it was not necessarily carved in stone. And remember, both the United States and Soviet Union were more concerned about their own interests and less concerned with these countries per se. 2-year war with Pakistan early on, border war with China in 1962. Again, ongoing conflict with Pakistan. India and China have been relatively at peace the last 60 years. Now, you see the name Indira Gandhi, and I want to tell you that she's the daughter of an independence leader. Gandhi's daughter? No, Gandhi's a fairly common name. She's actually the daughter of Nehru. And here's a problem. You will notice that in the first 37 years of India's history, for 35 of those years, it's Nehru or his daughter in charge. And when she was assassinated in 1984, her son took over. And this has definitely been a problem. The Congress Party started as the Indian National Congress in the 1880s, becomes a political party, has been dominated by that Nehru-Gandhi family. Hard to say terrible things about Nehru. He was tremendous, but at the same time, if it becomes kind of a personal family party, you can see some of the problems with this. War again with Pakistan in 1965, over Kashmir, and a major conflict with Bangladesh in 1971. This is really an ugly point of Pakistani history. West Pakistanis had, basically dominated that two-part Pakistan. East Pakistanis decide they want to declare themselves independent, and West Pakistan comes in not only with the military, but cuts off food supplies, leads to a massive famine in Bangladesh or in East Pakistan at that point. India comes in on the surface to protect the poor Bengali people who are being victimized, and they are, by Western Pakistan, but also they saw it to their benefit as well. Really key, 1974, India tests and successfully tests its own hydrogen bomb. India is a nuclear power. At this point, Pakistan decides they must also develop a nuclear weapon. In fact, the Pakistani President Bhutto says, we will eat grass for 10 years to pump enough money in developing our own nuclear weapon. Pakistan also becomes a nuclear power, and this has been and still is incredibly dangerous. The Green Revolution is key. Now, you remember Thomas Malthus? Ring a bell, anybody? Thomas Malthus was the British economist and minister who at the time of the early industrial revolution said, this is going to go badly because every family is going to have 6 children and 36 grandchildren and 216 great-grandchildren and 1,300 great-great-grandchildren. But you know what? Agricultural land isn't going to grow at that rate. I mean, it's going to increase, but not that dramatically. And it's not like you can make, today we make 10 bushels of corn off this land, and in 50 years we'll make 100. It's not going to happen like this. We're always going to face a food shortage. Turned out Malthus was wrong. New methods, new fertilizers, new genetics, new methods I don't understand, called the Green Revolution, means massive, massive, massive increase in agricultural output, and that allows a growing Indian population to feed itself. Again, as mentioned, Gandhi is assassinated in 1984. Her son eventually takes over. I won't go into the details of the assassination, but there has been conflict between Hindus and Sikhs as well. It's another part of the conflict story in India. The BJP, I won't try to pronounce it, but this is a Hindu nationalist party. Narendra Modi is, he's one of the sort of new generation of strongmen. I am a Hindu nationalist. I will crack down on Indian descent, very much like what we're seeing in the Philippines, what we're seeing with the Donald Trump in the United States, what we're seeing with Putin and Xi and Erdogan in Turkey. We are seeing increasingly more of a hardcore nationalism, and it's been pretty rough. There have been major attacks upon Muslim people in recent years, killings of about 10,000 Muslim people under horrifying circumstances in anti-Muslim riots. It's something that India is certainly going to have to deal with. He remains in power, and there is a lot more division among religion. Remember, not all the Muslims in India moved to Pakistan, not even close to that. Foreign policy-wise, India has started to move closer to the United States. Nominally, better relations with Pakistan, but that is always a powder keg ready to go off. India's economy absolutely boomed. Now, I had mentioned that Gandhi, who is, held as a hero to many people, and there are some incredibly noble things about Gandhi, and certainly a courage and an integrity. And, there are some... The idea that Gandhi did not believe in racism, no. Gandhi himself was appalled in South Africa that Indians were being treated like lowly blacks. Gandhi was a man of his time, like everybody else. Had some kind of odd attitudes, I would think, toward women that many of us would have a hard time with. And there was also a naivety to Gandhi. Gandhi believed that India needed to remain and go back to being an agricultural society, that industrialization and modernization was wrong and we can grow our own food. And although he never held elected office, he was very influential. So you'll see economic growth in India for the first 30 or so years, but not a lot. And there are those who argue that because of Gandhi's idea of not modernizing, this kept hundreds of millions of Indians in pretty desperate poverty for a number of decades. And, you blame Gandhi for that. Yeah, it's hard to say. But anyway, a mixed legacy like all historical figures. Major economic growth begins in the 1980s. And you look at these numbers, what do we mean by 8% growth, 7%, 9%? Well, a way of thinking about this, we call it the rule of 70. You take the number 70 and you divide it by the growth rate. So you're looking at these years of 9% growth. 70 divided by 9 is about 8. At 9% growth, the Indian economy or any economy would double every 8 years, or quadruple in wealth every 16 years, or octuple, I don't know if that's a word, every 32 years. Or, in other words, you see a doubling that increases. It's exponential growth, and that is the power of exponential growth. So India today has a lot of very, very, very poor people, no question about it, but has seen pretty significant growth in the last 30 or 40 years. Interesting. COVID, of course, as I speak right now, is devastating India and will certainly be interesting to watch what happens with that. But on the whole, India has become a wealthier population in absolute terms and per capita in the last 30 or 40 years. And here's India in 2010. I didn't update this because this class technically with the AP ends in the year 2000, but over a billion people. It's probably closer to 1.3 billion today, etc. Notice that is about 4 times the United States in 1/3 of the size, a lot of which is desert. So food is always going to be a problem. You look at the population, there's still a substantial Muslim population, but of course less with Pakistan and Bangladesh gone. The HDI is Human Development Index. It is GDP per capita, and life expectancy and education level tries to get more than it just wealth, etc., etc. So India is certainly a growing economy, and like China, a lot of the same issues. People living better, to be sure, still a lot of poverty, and of course the environmental impact of massive, massive growth in a country of this size, using fuel sources like coal and oil, a problem for the Indians, problem for all of us, of course, too. And I don't know why that's back there again, but there it is. Yeah, Pakistan became separate and independent then from India, from England as well in 1947. East and West Pakistan, these are just 2 separate areas, but West Pakistan had the larger population and it was the seat of government as well. Mentioning that East Pakistan secedes in 1971. It is bloody, it is ugly, it leads to an overthrow of the overall Pakistani government because the military folks responsible for losing were held accountable, and just horrific, horrific mass imposed starvation as a method of warfare. 1971 is mentioned. The crisis in East Pakistan, i.e. the separation of Bangladesh, leads to an overthrow of the military government. For most of the first 25 years of Pakistan's history, the military rules directly. So you get a civilian rule. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, his name is. Bhutto is largely a secularist. However, he starts recognizing the growing power of the Islamist population in Pakistan and begins to impose some fairly strict religious-based laws, not because he himself was terribly religious, but wanted to make nice with the growing Islamist power. Bhutto was basically, and this is quite a phrase to be using in the late 20th century, he was a feudal lord. And you say, feudalism? You mean like, serfs and lords back in the 14th century? When I was in Pakistan 12, 13 years ago, the word feudal lord and feudalism was used constantly in the newspapers. In fact, I had a student, his name was Perano. Perano, in talking with him, said, well, Mr. Ziegler, my dad is the lord of about 300,000 people. I said, you mean like a feudal lord? Absolutely. They are his serfs, and pretty much he's in control of them. And I'm stunned by this because I thought this disappeared centuries ago. He said, the reason I'm at this American school is that my father wants me to see a different experience because there's an understanding in our family that this is probably not the best system, but I am going to inherit this land and the people on it, and I hope to make some sort of different decisions. I said, will you abandon feudalism? He says, Mr. Ziegler, if I stand out and say I'm abandoning the system, I'll be dead within a day. So, I'm not sure really what happened with Perano exactly, but this is a very, very different world than what we're used to in the West, as it were. In 1977, Bhutto is overthrown by, I can't remember his first name, but Zia-ul-Haq is his name, and he is a legitimate fundamentalist Sunni Muslim who wants to impose the strictest form of Sharia law upon Pakistan. And this is where Pakistan, quite legitimately, has a reputation as being a very, very intolerant country today toward religious minorities. You know, it's frustrating because this is not the history of India, and it's not the history of Pakistan. It began as a very, very secular state that happened to have a Muslim majority. But as the Islamist world begins to grow, and we'll see a little bit of this as we talk about the modern Middle East, you start to see Islamism, Sharia law imposed, and it's at times very, very severe. I know from having lived there. I had friends, for example, who were Muslim born but not religious people or even atheists. They didn't tell me this for a year and a half, and when they did, said, do not say this to anybody. Because that can be, first of all, it is illegal to be a non-believer, to question the absolute truth of the Quran, etc. But it even goes beyond that, is that you'll find vigilante groups. If somebody is seen as a non-believer, it's a very, very rough place to be. Well, it's important that Zia-ul-Haq took power, because what happened in 1979? In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded neighboring Afghanistan. And the United States said, well, we've got to support the people in Afghanistan fighting against the Soviet Union. We'll send, billions of dollars of weapons and supplies and training through our ally in Pakistan, who will then train the Afghanis. But of course, the Pakistani system, the Pakistani government is deeply, deeply fundamentalist Islamic. And these are the people that they fund in Afghanistan. And I think you have some sense of where that went. Zia-ul-Haq dies in a plane crash in 1988, and there are democracies. Notice the quotation marks of Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif, and one wins an election, the other one wins. And, it's a civilian democracy, but both regimes are pretty darn corrupt. I mean, I know we talk about corruption in Bolivia. It's a whole other level, at least based on experience. They are both overthrown in 1998 with a military coup, and 3 years later, the 9/11 attacks, largely Saudi, but from a couple other countries as well, hijacked planes, Al-Qaeda, which was organized by a Saudi, Osama bin Laden, that had trained largely in Afghanistan and somewhat in Pakistan, attacked the United States, and the United States declares a war on terror. And you know what? The Pakistanis are told very clearly. President Musharraf is told by the United States, you will be on our side, or we will, quote unquote, bomb you back to the Stone Age. You will help us find bin Laden, destroy Al-Qaeda, etc. So Pakistan does not enter the war, but becomes a pretty intimate part of it. And you will find, too, that a lot of Pakistanis, particularly in the military, do not support the attacks on Afghanistan. So Pakistan has been kind of a tinderbox ever since for the last 20 years. Benazir Bhutto, daughter of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And interesting, you might say, well, women have a low place in the world of Islam, but there are numerous Muslim countries that have had female leaders, from Turkey to Indonesia to Pakistan to Bangladesh. So, more Muslim heads of states in these countries than, say, in the United States. So just kind of interesting. Interesting character, Western educated, but again, daughter of a former president, a feudal lord herself. She is actually assassinated when she comes back to the country in 2007. Her husband ends up being elected. His name was Asad Ali Zardari, and you notice his nickname, Mr. 10%. And he is widely recognized as just another level of corruption. Why that nickname, Mr. 10%? Because when he was her husband, it was widely understood that if the Pakistani government paid a private corporation $42 million to build, let's say, a new set of bridges, well, Mr. Zardari himself would get his 10% cut. And it's pretty legitimate, a pretty dumb guy from what I understand, and absolutely enriched himself. The current president of Pakistan, by the way, Imran Khan, is probably the most famous cricket star. That is the national game of Pakistan that I'm sure none of us understand the rules of it, but that's where Pakistan is today. And again, huge population, probably closing in on 200 million people. And by the way, look at that number below the age of 15. Now, that means that at least 37% of the population does not support itself economically. But if you think in Pakistan, where, especially in the rural areas, where women are expected to stay in the home, where they're very much segregated, you have a pretty small part of the population trying to support 200 million people. By the way, that's not universal. I mean, one of the parents of one of my students in Pakistan, she was a very devout Muslim. She dressed in the hijab, the headdress. She didn't shake hands with me, but she spoke to me in English confidently. She was the vice governor of the Sindh province, and she talked about the vital importance of creating a education for women to economically and socially empower women. Yes, conservative Muslim and very much a feminist, and those two things can go back and hand in hand. It is largely a Muslim population, a significant Shia minority that is very, very much discriminated against and often targeted by violence. Huge difference in ethnic groups. You know, the national language is called Urdu. It's basically the Hindi language of India, but with a different script. But you'll notice it's not the first language of any more than about 10-12% of the people of Pakistan. Pakistan may be a state far more than it's a nation. But yeah, very, very poor country, has seen economic growth for sure, but still poor and much poorer overall than India. And then Afghanistan, which is not technically part of the subcontinent. It's kind of the division between the Middle East and the subcontinent, but I think it's worth looking at in this section. First of all, I have mentioned this. If you ever become the president of your country, 2 rules, 2 suggestions. 1, don't invade Russia, because you know what? It's too big. It's too vast. There are too many Russians. Your army will be destroyed. And the second, don't invade Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a small population. It's very poor. But 3 major empires have decided in the last 200 years to invade Afghanistan, and it did not work out well for anyone. In the 19th century, England and this growing Russian empire were battling for control in Afghanistan, not because of Afghani resources, but geographically. It's located in the center between the oil resources of the Middle East and, the road to India, etc., etc. The British attempt to invade Afghanistan 3 times and bring a government that is subservient to the British. And I won't tell you the Afghans defeat the British, because they, don't defeat the British army. They don't invade London and take over Westminster Abbey. But they do cause tremendous difficulty, lots of death, great expenses. I think you can overstate this to a degree, but it's a bottom line ethnic pride thing within the major ethnic groups in Afghanistan, that although these are incredibly hospitable, warm, caring people, if you cross them, there is going to be no limit to what they will do for revenge. It was once said of an Afghan man waited 400 years to get his revenge. It was a very short wait. In other words, if you send your soldiers in, you kill some of our people, you take our land, you humiliate our women, we will get you. And the British are greatly weakened by these attempts to control Afghanistan. You remember the Radcliffe Line dividing Pakistan and India? Well, you see the Durand Line. Again, another Brit who takes out a map, divides. This is Afghanistan. This is our India. Of course, dividing the ethnic Pathans, who I think are the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan and one of the biggest in Pakistan. Look, Pathan people don't recognize that line. And in fact, the territory that is between Pakistan and Afghanistan is strictly speaking part of Pakistan, but it is called the tribal lands. And I'll tell you, the Pakistani government has no authority at all whatsoever in that region. I walked about 200 meters into the tribal land and thought, I am really playing with fire, because if somebody comes after me, there is no law here. But a couple of friends of mine that have actually gone over the border say that you'll see people, here you'll go down to the market and see a woman sitting out front with onions and choclo with corn sitting on a blanket. You might see heroin and machine guns there. Actually, often American supplied machine guns to fight the Russians in the 70s and 80s that have remained there, and you can get an AK-47, semi-automatic rifle without really trying very hard, and you can openly buy it because there is no law. Afghanistan is declared an independent country in 1919. However, major powers trying to influence it very greatly to this very day. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979, trying to remove a non-communist government, and just like the British found 60 to 80 years earlier, they can't do it. It ends up being tremendously expensive. The costs of the war, tens of thousands of Russians killed, and it certainly hurts the credibility of the Soviet government. This is the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and it is not the cause of the Soviet Union dissolving in 1991, but it is a cause to be sure. The Mujahideen, these are Muslim guerrilla warriors that are organizing to expel the Soviet Union. Many of them come from the Arab states. They're called the Afghan Arabs, and because they are the enemies of the Americans' Soviet enemy, they are heavily funded by the United States. One of them was a young Saudi billionaire. His father was a multi-billionaire, and he decided to give up his life of comfort and come to fight for Islam in Afghanistan. You might know the name. Here he was in 1982-83, and his name is Osama bin Laden. So bin Laden, yes, very much he and what became Al-Qaeda, initially heavily funded by the United States, the CIA, because they were there fighting the Soviet Union. Remember, your enemy's enemy is not always your friend. Soviets pull out and Afghanistan plunges into a horrific civil war. In 1996, a radical, ultra-fundamentalist Sunni army takeover. They're called the Taliban. Taliban means student of Islam. And the Taliban rules over Afghanistan. The United States does not officially recognize them, but they end up with fairly decent relationship because, you know what? Major natural gas supplies have been found in Afghanistan. And then 2001, September 11th, the attacks on the United States with the Pentagon, the World Trade Center, and it is widely thought and probably true that Afghanistan or the tribal areas of Pakistan is where Osama bin Laden, the head of Al-Qaeda, is staying. The United States says to Afghanistan, turn this man over to us immediately. Afghanistan says, look, that's not how we operate. We don't even know he's here. And the United States basically begins a war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan eventually does kill bin Laden in about 2007, I believe. The Taliban is driven from power initially, but still to this date, 2021, controls big parts of Afghanistan. The United States right now is finally, after 20 years, planning to withdraw. It's been incredibly expensive, not very successful, has probably created more problems than wish. Again, don't invade Afghanistan. Since 2001, the United States, supports anybody who'll do their bidding. Mohammed Karzai was an ex-oil executive. Still controls, the Taliban does, much of the country, and a lot of concern, what's going to happen when the U.S. finally leaves? Does the Taliban take control of the entire country? Will there be a renewed civil war? We can barely know this. But it's been another 20 horrific years for the Afghanis, to be sure. And Afghanistan, as of 2010, look at that population below the age of 15. I keep pointing to that because that's huge. These are people who, well, A, they're not contributing economically to the country. B, in the next 15, 18, 20 years, they're going to need education and jobs and housing and expect to have their own families, and that's going to be a problem. And the other thing, too, is that you think about the emotionality of youth. I mean, things could go very badly in my life, but at 56 years old, the likelihood that I will take to the street with a weapon, I've got a family and my job is okay, But young people, if they feel desperation, they are much more likely to engage in direct action. So if you want an idea, a shortcut to thinking what countries could undergo major civil unrest or even a revolution, look at that age, that 8% below age 15. Life expectancy is so short, and that's because of poverty, but because of warfare, all of these things. It is considered by most to be for a variety of reasons. I mean, Afghanistan hasn't known peace in 40 some years. It's a desperately, desperately poor and divided country. I think this may be the very last slide, so I will bid you a farewell. If there's one more, I'll think of something clever to say. But I think this is it.